Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Well, welcome everyone to the fourth annual Luce Hartford Conference on Christian-Muslim relations. This is the second evening of the conference, and I'd like to welcome you all. Salam alaikum and peace be with you. This conference happens every year in June, and normally we have it as a face-to-face conference at Hartford Seminary. But of course, this year, because of extenuating circumstances, we've chosen to do it as a live webinar, both on Zoom and also live on Facebook. So last night we had people from all around the world who attended the conference, and that's the case for today as well. We have people from Indonesia and Egypt and Europe. So fantastic. And of course, one of our keynote speakers is from Canada. So it's truly an international event tonight. So the Luce Hartford Conference on Christian-Muslim Relations gathers Muslim and Christian scholars and religious practitioners to discuss an important and timely theme related to peace, justice, and equality in our world. In the past, our themes have focused on such things as immigration and refugee issues, the environment, race, and this year, we commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and the women's suffrage movement in the United States with the theme, the agency and vital voices of women, Muslim and Christian religiosity and scholarship. We hope you will enjoy, learn, and be challenged by our speakers this week. The conference will address the role of women in women's scholarly voices in scripture and theology and society, the leadership role of women in Muslim and Christian communities, and the impact of female theological and scriptural perspectives on Christian-Muslim relationships. Now, something very quickly about Hartford Seminary. If you're not familiar with Hartford Seminary, the seminary was founded in 1834 and is a non-denominational graduate school for religious and theological studies. And we are proud to be a seminary of firsts. The first seminary in America to admit women to full-time study, the first seminary to have a full-time Muslim faculty member, and the first to have a fully accredited Islamic chaplaincy program. What makes us unique is our multi-faith environment and our proven ability to prepare leaders for a complex world that surrounds us, a multi-faith world. Now, a few words about the format for this evening, this webinar format. So all attendees who are logged in are muted and not visible, so you can be safe in that. You are able to ask questions through the Q&A box. So as a question comes to mind, please use the Q&A box and send that question. We have several people who will be fielding that, and then our moderator will ask those questions. For the speakers, the keynote speakers, just a reminder to mute yourself when you're not speaking, and then to unmute yourself when you're ready to speak. And I will be keeping time for the keynote speakers, so if you hear a voice suddenly from the heavens, I'm not trying to be rude, it's just keeping us all on time. At the end of the evening, we'll have a poll from Susan Schoenberger who will come on, and we'll also have a visit from our admissions office from Tina Demo. Later tomorrow, you should be receiving an evaluation form in your email that you registered with. Please do take time to fill out that evaluation form because that helps us in our planning. Now, without further ado, our moderator for this evening is Dr. Chanel T. Smith, the Associate Professor of New Testament and Christian Origins and the Director of the Cooperative Master of Divinity Program. I give you now Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Dr. Grafton. I am so glad to be with you all again tonight. Good evening and welcome to our newcomers and welcome back to those who were with us yesterday. It was truly an amazing event and I know that you all will be even more amazed tonight. If you did miss it, I want to remind you that we are still streaming yesterday's event live on Facebook. So please like it, click it, share it, do all of that stuff. Once again, I have the distinct honor and pleasure to introduce two of my esteemed colleagues, sister scholars, and friends. I invite you to read their full biographies on the Hartford Seminary website, as I will only highlight just a few aspects of their contributions to scholarship, faith communities, and the world. Our first keynote speaker for this evening is Dr. Jasmine Zine. She is professor of sociology and religion and culture and Muslim studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario, Canada. Her books include the co-edited volume, Muslim Women, Transnational Feminism and the Ethics of Pedagogy, Contested Imaginaries in Post-911 Cultural Practice, Islam and the Hinterlands, Muslim Cultural Politics in Canada, and Canadian Islamic Schools, Unraveling the Politics of Faith, Gender, Knowledge, and Identity. Professor Zine has completed a 6-year-long national study on the impact of 9/11, the war on terror, and domestic security discourses and policies on Canadian Muslim youth, and is currently finishing a book manuscript based on this study, tentatively titled Under Siege: Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation. Oh, that sounds really, really intriguing. She has been giving numerous invited talks and keynotes at conferences and forums in places such as Istanbul, Paris, Vienna, Berlin, Amsterdam, just to name a few. The rest of them are listed on her biography. She is also a sought-after media commentator on Islamophobia, racism, and Muslims in Canada. But even more important to me, having served on a committee with her, I can say that Dr. Zine is a beautiful soul, a great mentor, and Willem shares whatever knowledge she has for the benefit of others without lording it over them. And so thank you for being that for me, Dr. Zine. Everyone, I present to you our first keynote speaker this evening, Dr. Jasmine Zine, who will be speaking on the topic, Engaged Resistance, Muslim Women Responding to and Challenging Islamophobia. Dr. Zine.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you. Greetings from Canada, from Turtle Island. I'm coming to you from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat people, and want to honor the colonial legacy of the land that we are occupying. I'm really pleased to take part in this conference despite the very fraught times we find ourselves at in this moment. In these very turbulent times, I'm reminded of Surah 94 in the Quran, which tells us, "Verily with hardship comes ease." Now this surah of the Quran is entitled The Expansion. And it's interesting because in times of hardship, we often experience this as a contraction. So this reminds us of the expansion that comes along with it. And what's interesting for me about this verse is that it promises the ease along with the hardship, not after. And so I take that as a message to look for the blessings in disguise as we surrender to the grace of the moment. So this is also a good time, I think, for me to say that I am not a theologian. I am a sociologist. And so my remarks this evening are going to be drawing upon the political understandings that come from my work rather than its theological implications. But I hope that it will inform those ideas and interventions for those of you who are engaged in that work. I should also say this is my first time doing anything on Zoom, so it feels a little artificial, and I hope that that doesn't come across in my demeanor, but yes, there's a first time for everything, and we are in extraordinary times, so we must adapt. And so I'm here to talk about, and was asked to speak about, agency and resistance. And these are processes that have been central to a lot of my ethnographic work for over 20 years now. Specifically, I was asked to address agency and resistance as related to Muslim women and the perils of Islamophobia. Now, for me, these issues came together in a new way during the pandemic crisis. I recently wrote an op-ed on unmasking the racial politics of the pandemic, where I reflected on the semiotics of wearing protective masks that have become a cultural icon, and how the meanings attached to wearing masks shifts depending on the bodies that are wearing them. I argue that rather than being a kind of leveling device, masking reveals the racial fault lines that underline the pandemic. So while wearing a protective mask signifies a sense of social responsibility, upholding public health and safety, and being a good citizen, these positive meanings shift when the mask is worn by specific racialized bodies. For example, if you're Asian, rather than signifying protection from contagion, your masked body becomes the yellow peril, and you are seen as a diseased foreigner and pandemic starter under the racial tropes that have existed for maybe 100 years around anti-Asian racism in North America. If you're a masked Black man, you risk being seen as a potential threat and public menace instead of someone upholding the public good. Sadly, we've witnessed the deadly consequences of this racial stereotyping. There is also state hypocrisy when it comes to mandating face masks, but at the same time prohibiting Muslim women from wearing a niqab or face veil. In Quebec, under Bill 21, Muslim women wearing a niqab are denied access to social services or even riding on public transport. At the same time, others are being mandated to wear a protective mask. So we see the hypocrisy there. In France, wearing a niqab makes you subject to a fine and mandatory citizenship classes, while for others, wearing a COVID-19 protective mask means you are performing good citizenship. So while the COVID-19 mask signifies shared community values that support the public good, the niqab is read as subservience to patriarchal tribal values that are inconsistent with Western virtues and ideals. The covered faces of niqabi women make them culturally irreconcilable with Western civility. Niqabi women face public banishment, while others wearing protective masks are lauded as public saviors. The COVID-19 mask is a barrier to the social transmission of the virus, while the niqab is a barrier to social inclusion. The legal, cultural, and ontological distinctions made in this equation marks the terrain where Orientalist fears collide with multicultural angst. The disciplining of Muslim women's bodies, whether they are forced to uncover themselves in some Western nations or forced to cover themselves under some authoritarian theocratic Muslim states, denies their agency in the choices that they make about their bodies. So there are many ways that Muslim women's agency is challenged or viewed as a threat. I want to explore this through the conditions of Islamophobia. So I'm going to talk about three particular facets of this. First, I'll start with a definition of Islamophobia, since there are many meanings and understandings about it. I want to discuss then, secondly, the gendered and global manifestations of Islamophobia. And third, rethink the question of agency and resistance. So it's a lot to do in a short time, but I will try, inshallah, as we say. So starting with the definition of Islamophobia, and there are many, so I'm going to put forward my definition of Islamophobia that I've used since 2004. And that is to say that Islamophobia can be best understood as a system of oppression that operates through individual acts, ideologies, and systemic practices that support the logic and rationale of specific power relationships. So I like to imagine this sort of as an iceberg, and at the tip of the iceberg, what you often see are the individual actions surrounding this form of oppression. So things like hate crimes, vandalism, name calling, exclusion, daily microaggressions. So, but this moves from the day-to-day to the deadly. So part of this includes something that happened in Canada in 2017, which was a massacre in Quebec at a mosque in Quebec City, where 6 men were killed by white nationalist terrorists after their evening prayers. So these individual actions are range in their saliency and severity, but they are the tip of the iceberg. What's below the water is what supports and upholds those actions and rationalizes and justifies them. So we have on the one side ideologies. So when we think about the ideologies of Islamophobia that are dominant in North American context, things like Muslims are terrorists, public safety threats, the fifth column, Islamists who want to destroy the West and install a caliphate, illiberal minorities, misogynists, and so on. or what Shireen Razak talks about as well as dangerous Muslim men and imperiled Muslim women. So Muslim women are seen as backward, subservient to men, oppressed victims of a fanatical religion. Now, Muslims become interpolated into these discourses that are uncritically absorbed as common sense propositions that are filtered through the institutions of civil society, which make them quintessentially hegemonic. Now, those ideas serve to rationalize and justify not only individual actions that I described, but systemic practices that allow for this system to become continually reproduced. So some of the systemic practices would be things like racial profiling at the borders, no-fly lists, security certificates. The security industrial complex is tied to Islamophobia. There's also the denial of jobs, housing, educational barriers, and so on. And so it's important to understand Islamophobia as a dynamic. Now, Islamophobia obviously affects Muslims, but also affects anyone perceived to be Muslim. So think about the fact that the first person who was shot in a reprisal to the 9/11 attacks was a Sikh man. A Gurdwara in the United States was attacked because it was thought to be a mosque. So even Barack Obama was accused of being Muslim and subject to Islamophobia in that sense. So even the most powerful man in the world has been subject to Islamophobia. So it isn't only Muslims that are affected. Now, another related term, or sometimes a term that people prefer, is anti-Muslim racism. Now, the term anti-Muslim racism responds to the call to separate criticism of Islam from acts of discrimination against Muslims. And also, some would argue for political expediency. In other words, it sort of familiarizes the term with the understanding that people have a sense of what racism is, so then to put Islamophobia squarely in that category makes it more intelligible. I'm not sure that that's true because I'm not sure that people actually have a proper understanding of what racism is, but nonetheless, that's one of the arguments. Yet I would argue that anti-Muslim racism relies on the demonization of Islam, and therefore one doesn't exist without the other. So I consider Islamophobia as the overarching framework and anti-Muslim racism as a manifestation of that, which relies on the racialization of religion, or the ways in which racial markers become attached to specific religions. Now, in talking about that as well, it's important to recognize and acknowledge that Muslims are not a homogeneous group. We're talking about 2 billion people worldwide, different ethnic, racial, and sectarian backgrounds, not to mention social class divisions, north-south divides. And so it's important to resist attempts to homogenize Muslims into a single category. And we must remain cognizant of the intersectional specificities of Muslim identities. And that's also important to think about when we talk about the diverse population of Muslim women globally and how they see themselves and operate as agentic subjects and the modalities of resistance they engage in that I'm going to address shortly. This also brings us to a place of talking about gendered forms of Islamophobia. I'm credited with coining the term gendered Islamophobia back in 2006. And I argue that the discursive roots of gendered Islamophobia are historically entrenched within Orientalist representations that cast Muslim women as backward, oppressed victims of misogynistic religious cultures. So these ideas have been around for a long time, but they still have a lot of currency and traction in the present day. These representations have served to justify and rationalize imperial domination over colonized Muslims through the emancipatory effect that European hegemony was supposed to garner for Muslim women. Similar alibis were used for post-9/11 imperial wars and have been echoed by Western imperialist feminists and their call to, quote, save brown women from brown men, as Spivak famously coined that expression. And so in understanding these dimensions of Islamophobia and the gendered aspect, it's also important to look at it in a global context. We are often too fixated on ideas that are central to Western nations, and Islamophobia is a global phenomenon. And so I want to talk a bit about that. And as we begin to explore the post 9/11 era of Islamophobia, let me be clear, Islamophobia did not begin on September 12th, 2001. It has a long history and genealogy that I don't have time to get into, but let's just speak about that post 9/11 era of Islamophobia and the war on terror. There is an unrecognized, I think, algebra of violence when we talk about the tragedy of 9/11, where 3,000 people perished, and after that, 1.5 million have died in the war on terror. And that has been a nameless, faceless war over there in places that are simply viewed through a prism of death, so that the sheer numbers of people who have been killed become what Butler referred to as ungrievable bodies. I'm going to quote her here, where she says, quote, "We might think of war as dividing populations into those who are grievable and those who are not. An ungrievable life is one that cannot be mourned because it has never lived. That is, it is never counted as life at all." So in thinking of that and keeping the algebra of violence and those numbers in mind, Islamophobic dehumanization is what has allowed for the widespread state-sanctioned violence and genocide to take place with little moral outrage or action. In Iraq and Afghanistan, reactionary movements like Al-Qaeda and Daesh rely upon Islamophobia for their recruiting. There is a symbiotic relationship between Islamophobia and radicalization. And it's important to remember that white nationalism and white supremacy are not the only drivers of Islamophobia. There are dangerous forms of ethno-nationalism in countries like Burma, China, India, Kashmir, Palestine. Imperialism is also underwritten by Islamophobia. Muslim women and women in general are the most vulnerable in these circumstances. Globally, most refugees are women, and they face the most dire consequences of these militaristic actions, including rape and sexual violence. But despite these tragic circumstances, Muslim women should not be thought of as purely as victims. And we must understand their agencies and modality of resistance in nuanced ways, both in the global north and the global south. So in rethinking ideas of agency and resistance, I think it should be understood and recognized and theorized as it happens outside of larger social movements through the everyday practices that women engage in that may not qualify as acts of feminist resistance. For example, Bell Hooks reminds us that the enunciation of a feminist stance is not mandatory for feminist praxis, but rather it's the actions that lead to expanding the opportunities and critical consciousness of racialized women that make that qualification. Saba Mahmood encourages us to conceptualize agency not simply as a synonym for resistance to relations of domination, but as a capacity of action that specific relations of subordination create and enable. So in other words, the discourse and structures of subordination create the possibilities and conditions for specific enactments of resistance. And those don't always look the same. They take different forms and are expressed through different kinds of modalities. For example, in my ethnographic research on Islamophobia, I've talked to Muslim women who wear the hijab or the headscarf and feel they must be a corrective to the stereotypes and essentialized tropes of debased Muslim womanhood and these victim-centered ideas. And so they go out of their way to be outspoken, approachable, friendly, and civically engaged as a way to counter those stereotypes. So there is that burden of representation and responsibility that they feel to set the record straight, but it's also done to work against Islamophobic stereotypes. So they often talk about things like, giving up their seat on the subway and being extra friendly, smiling more, so people don't see them as strange or a threat or as some sort of an abject, sort of foreign body that has infiltrated society and is a threat in some way. So they go out of their way to perform that good Muslim. So even these small gestures can be seen as small acts of subversion against the dominant grammar of gendered Islamophobia. So there are different modalities of agency and resistance. Henry Giroux clarified acts of resistance as those that contain a moment of political critique. And so they're not always the most overt actions that we can speak of. In many contexts for women, who aren't necessarily engaged in wider social movements, there are many ways in which they employ strategies in their day-to-day life that may not subvert the various structures that they are facing, whether it's around Islamophobia or patriarchy or sexism or other kinds of interlocking oppressions that they face, but it does allow them to maneuver within those spaces. I think Saba Mahmood's work on the politics of piety is very, very instructive in looking at those smaller spaces of subversion and resistance and the need to sort of delink agency from larger progressive movements, that there's a lot of ways that women exercise agency and resistance that we don't always immediately recognize in the ways that we have framed it. So I did want to talk about those different ways of understanding agency and resistance. I want to now just take this back to the global context, because we already talk a lot about what happens in North America and Western context, but we often don't think about agency and resistance of women in places abroad where Islamophobia is very large and widespread, and it is very salient in a lot of places, not just in the West, right? So again, white supremacy, white nationalism isn't the only driver. There's a lot of very dangerous forms of ethno-nationalism that manifest Islamophobia. So for example, in China, we think about the Uyghurs, the Muslim minority in China, where over 1 million have been relegated to so-called re-education camps. They cannot practice their religion. They are forced to eat pork, cannot fast in Ramadan. Men are sent to work camps while male visitors, who are actually spies, are staying in their homes and sleep in the same beds as the women. And this is a program of the state where the surveillance is far beyond Orwellian proportions. And this is only a small rendering of what's happening there. But when we look at Muslim Uyghur women who lack the ability in the smaller space, in the confines of the situation they find themselves in China, but when they are able to leave, those who have gone to various places like Turkey, for example, you find Muslim Uyghur women who are very involved in diasporic struggles of resistance and are involved in various kinds of digital campaigns to raise awareness and to try and help their families back home.
10 minutes.
Thank you. For another example that I'll share is that of the Rohingya people. And Rohingyas are an indigenous group of Muslims in Burma. And they have been subject to Islamophobia there as part of a national campaign that has been described as a textbook case of ethnic cleansing to a slow burn genocide. So this Buddhist Islamophobia and Burmese military aggression has been devastating for the Rohingya people, who have had their villages burned and decimated. People have been forced into boats. And those who survive the perils of drowning in treacherous water are languishing in refugee camps in Bangladesh or trafficked in Thailand. 1 million Rohingya have been violently forced out of Burma and live as refugees. In cases like this, where you're being collectively erased from your indigenous homeland, memory and testimony are acts of resistance. And I think this is true in other places, but I wanted to highlight the Rohingya case. Not a lot of people know about it, and we have to ask ourselves how there is a genocide that has been recognized by the United Nations as such, is not on everybody's radar right now, because it's happening in front of the world community. And yet is in the shadows of most people's awareness or understanding. And so I'm taken back to Butler's notion about those ungrievable lives. One of the interventions that I want to focus on in bringing awareness to the Rohingya plight was actually a play and later a film called I Am Rohingya, A Genocide in 4 Acts. And it's a bit of a shameless plug because my son is the writer and director and producer of this. But what he did was work with a group of 15 Rohingya refugee youth who found themselves and their families now in Canada. And he was working with them, in a sort of summer program to sort of get them acclimated to life in Canada. And he asked them, what is it that you want to do? And they all said, unequivocally, and they were from ages of 8 to, I think, 20, 15 youth, we want to tell our stories. So they wanted to do a play. And of these 15 youth, half of them were women from ages of about 10 to 18 years old. And they wanted to tell the story of their people. They wanted the world to know what was happening because the Rohingyas were being erased from existence, erased from the history books, and physically and forcibly removed and pushed into the water in their homeland. And so in this 4-act play, called I Am Rohingya, the young women reenact the Islamophobic violence that their families experienced at the hands of the Burmese military and Buddhist nationalists. Part of the ethnic cleansing or the eugenic process, the eugenic nationalism that wanted to produce a clean nation, which did not include the Rohingya, who they saw as interlopers and not as indigenous people to Burma. So these youth, half of them, as I said, young women and girls, came together to tell their harrowing stories in this 4-act play. And now it is featured in a powerful documentary that chronicles the struggle of their family to flee the brutal genocide in Burma and live in crowded refugee camps in Bangladesh, and then make their way to Canada to start a new life. The women in this film reenact their experiences to show the world what is happening to their people. And that became very important and drove them in that process. Again, an example of their agency and of their resistance through using theater and film as an expression of resistance. And we can speak about this process as one of creating counter stories, as a means of countering the epistemic privilege by centering marginalized voices and experience as the critical interlocutors on social and political realities that they experience, their everyday lives of subordination and oppression that they deal with, and centering them as agents of transformation and as political actors, because now the work that they produce does important political work around the world. And so these counter stories are activated as strategies of survival and resistance among marginalized groups in an effort to speak truth to power. So those are just a few small examples of the way that Muslim women are reacting to the Islamophobia in their daily life in Western nations, as well as the violence of the state and military forms of Islamophobia abroad. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zane, for a very insightful presentation. And I have lots of questions for you, but we'll wait until the end after we hear from Dr. Smith. So as we did yesterday, we will wait for a Q&A until after both of our keynote speakers have spoken. Our next keynote speaker for this evening is none other than the Reverend Dr. Shively T.J. Smith. Now, when folk ask us if we are sisters, it happens a lot. We collectively say yes, not only because we share similar initials, but also because of sister that we have for many years in the academy as well as beyond. So I'm so grateful to call you my sister. I love you, Shively.
I love you too. I'm sorry.
The Reverend Dr. Shively T.J. Smith is Assistant Professor of New Testament at Boston University School of Theology. She completed her PhD in New Testament Studies at Emory University as the first African-American female degreed in that specialization. She is the author of the book Strangers to Family, Diaspora and First Peter's Invention of God's Household. She is also completing a commentary on 2 Peter and several articles on 19th century African-American women writers and the Bible. As a scholar of New Testament, Dr. Smith writes and teaches on all 27 books of New Testament, but her particular focus is on the letters from Hebrews to Jude, approaches to biblical interpretation, womanist and African-American biblical interpretation, and Howard Thurman. Professor Smith is an ordained itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church and resident scholar at the historic Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, D.C. Professor Smith is a sought-after scholar and preacher and is dedicated to the service of academic theological studies and ecumenical conversations in the public square, and I'm a witness of this. Dr. Smith is my sister, my colleague, my dear friend, and she is brilliant, but I will let you hear that for yourself. Again, please, as your questions arise, type them in the Q&A section. Dr. Smith, I turn it over to you for your keynote address, Womanist Voices in the Academy.
Thank you so much for that wonderful, wonderful introduction, Dr. Smith. First, let me share my thanks to the coordinators of the 2020 Luce Hartford Conference webinar for convening such an important conversation about the agency and vital voices of women, Muslim and Christian religiosity and scholarship. I must say, encouraged by the speed and innovative proposals that the coordinators offered to the group of us to shift the conference online when the pandemic occurred. I applaud the responsiveness and creativity of the organizers and coordinators to make this moment available in an online platform. So bravo and brava for that. It is an honor to be counted one among my distinguished colleagues this week as we reflect on the agency and voices of Muslim and Christian women collectively. I look forward to the ways we engage each other's perspectives and hopefully build on each other's perspectives as we go forward in our own scholar teacher work moving forward. I was asked to reflect on the histories and distinctions of womanist voices in the academy. As a New Testament biblical scholar, historian, and African-American woman Christian, I want to do that by looking at African-American women's interactions with the Christian Bible and dialogue about the Christian Bible. In particular, I'm interested in the interpretive approaches 19th century African-American women writers and their interpretations of the Bible, or what I like to call the interpretive products these women produced. Given our short time together, I'm going to provide just a sample of the dynamic interpretive repertoire of approaches and perspectives these women have left us that may in fact be the very perspectives and approaches we need to dialogue at the intersections of religiosity, scholarship, history, society, and yes, politics. In addition, I suggest they also provide us frames for remembering what civil discourse looks like and pathways for imagining the forms interpretive discourse can take both then and now. In the 19th century, these women were using public discourse forms such as poetry, novels, public addresses they revised into journalistic essays, pamphlets, and even autobiographies. The specific title for this paper, keeping in mind the topic of womanist voices in the academy, is Seeing Through Our Eyes and Hearing Through Our Ears, exploring the beginnings of African-American women's literary interpretive history of the Bible. Just a quick refresher, since we have such a wide viewing online, for those who may be unfamiliar with the term womanist, particularly the meaning or perspectives of womanist voices in the field of biblical studies, let me take a moment to define it here. Womanist biblical interpretation, as understood by the first African-American woman to receive a PhD in the New Testament, in New Testament studies, Dr. Clarice Martin, begins as an interpretive approach that, quote, privileges African-American women's historic and contemporary experiences, voices, and perspectives purposefully, self-consciously, and practically as both a starting point and as a resource for reconstructing the history of the Christian Bible in America and for interpreting the Christian Bible within African-American communities, histories, and culture. I take Martin's working description as my point of departure for asserting that womanist biblical interpretation is a dynamic avenue for resourcing the biblical text to engage the particularities of African-American history and religion, society, culture, and the world. But it is also a way of engaging, or as I stated in my title of this paper, it is also a way of seeing and hearing the broader interlocking histories of communities, cultures, institutions, and power outside of African-American communities. Womanist biblical interpretation creates pathways for attending to how the Bible is interpreted, referenced, and deployed in non-African-American spaces, institutions, and by peoples. Martin distills womanist biblical interpretation into 4 primary tasks, which I adopt and then try to expand in some strategic ways in my other works, which I will give you a taste of in my presentation in a few moments. But let me give you these 4 tasks of Martin, of womanist biblical interpretation presented to us by Clarice Martin that I build upon. The first task is reconstruction of the ancient biblical worlds, languages, cultures, and symbols of the Christian Bible. The second task of womanist biblical interpretation is put forward by Martin is retrieval and reclamation of forgotten contemporary histories and stories, or what I call the interpretive points of sight of later interpreting communities, especially the points of sight of African-American women. The third task is challenging the persistent and normative narrowness of biblical interpreters on the subject of race, to which I add class, religion, xenophobia, ageism, and so forth. And the fourth primary task of womanist biblical interpretation, according to Martin, is documentary analysis of the social, historical, and political effects of dominant American exegetical readings and practices on generations of African Americans, to which I also expand that to include the necessity of us doing documentary analysis on the systemic, institutional, and relational effects dominant white American and European world biblical readings have had on generations of multicultural, multi-religious, multilingual institutions and peoples in and beyond the Western world. Renita Weems, the first African-American woman to earn a PhD in Hebrew Bible, provides a similar description of the starting points of womanist voices in biblical studies conversations. Weems quotes the 19th century African-American woman educator and activist, Anna Julia Cooper, for whom I will talk more about in a few moments, to define the task of womanist biblical interpretation. Weems says, quote, African-American womanist perspective calls for broader scope to the feminist hermeneutical critique. It is simply not enough to treat sexism in the biblical canon as paradigmatic or deserving alone of critical examination and challenge. All insinuations in the canon of oppression and repression deserve our critique and attention. Wherever one segment of biblical society presumed theological legitimation for silencing, supplanting, or destroying another segment, that should sound an alarm to our research, end quote. Womanist biblical interpretation in the academy, or womanist voices in the Biblical Academy now as it unfolds in some of my contemporaries, such as Will Gaffney, Mitzi Smith, Kimberly Russell, Gay Byron, and your own Chanel Smith, and others, continue to sound the alarm. However, I think Weems is correct in her move to retrieve the voice of an ancestor to establish the basis of African American women's perspectives and reconstructions of the Bible. Neither Weems nor Martin nor any of my contemporaries are creating this voice. Rather, we are simply retrieving and expanding what we are talking about in relationship to the Bible, and who we engage in the process, and in the sources we leverage and access. The quotation from Anna Julia Cooper that Weems uses to describe womanist biblical interpretation as an alert sounding approach or voice from below or from the margins of American history embodied in African American women's experience is key. This quote is taken from Dr. Cooper's 1893 address delivered at the 1892 Congress of Representative Women at the Columbian or Chicago World's Fair. The address is titled "The Intellectual Progress of the Colored Woman of Colored Women in the United States Since the Emancipation Proclamation." Hear this quote. "Now, I think if I could crystallize the sentiment of my constituency and deliver it as a message to this Congress of women, it would be something like this. Let woman's claim be as broad in the concrete as in the abstract. We take our stand on the solidarity of humanity, the oneness of life, and the unnaturalness and injustice of all special favoritisms, whether of sex, race, country, or condition, and I would ask, or of religion. If one link of the chain be broken, the chain is broken." For those watching the screen, I'm sure I do not have to explain the context of this photo. Just over a week ago, this is the photo opportunity the President of the United States took in front of a church after gassing and attacking peaceful protesters in front of the White House to clear his path to walk across Lafayette Park to awkwardly hold a Bible for all to see. I am not going to address the immediate circumstances beyond that leading up to the moment, nor the fallout, outrage, and shock it has generated this past week. Rather, I want to use it as a visual moment to think in a very particular way about the history of African American women biblical scholars, not just in the academy, but in society. When I first saw this image on the news, I stopped dead in my tracks. I was puzzled, as I'm sure many of you were, by what I was viewing and its significance. He was holding the Bible outside of a boarded up church, but he was not reading it. So he did not use the moment to give voice to the messages or to lift up any biblical themes or images contained within it, not even as one finds in quote unquote 2 Corinthians. He also did not use the Bible as a means to pray or as a mandate to sing or to kneel or to pause in even a reverential, humble silence. He did not use it to make space for centering himself around what Howard Thurman would call God's presence or the source beyond oneself. In other words, the president did not use the Bible to orient himself differently to the immediate world around him or the worlds and contexts beyond him. Similar to the reporter who asked the president, "Is that your Bible?" I found myself asking, whose Bible is that? Yet my question was not about personal ownership, but about representation. Whose Bible is being represented here? More to the point, whose interpretive lens and biblical vision is being lifted up and signified in this photo? Two interpretive histories clash for me when I look at this picture. One is the history of the Bible and biblical interpretive process in Euro-American Christianity. Frances Fitzgerald, in her book, The Evangelicals, The Struggle to Shape America, argues and presents that German biblical criticism, coupled with American biblical criticism, was one of the new intellectual currents flowing through the North and the South during and after the Civil War, shaping dominant white evangelical biblical culture and politics. The other interpretive history, in contrast, is the history of the Bible and biblical interpretive process in African American Christianity. I want to suggest that this moment captures a particular species of biblical religion in America that does not resonate with African American biblical engagement, particularly African American women's public literary biblical engagement as it emerges in the 19th century. African American women were using a different set of resources alongside the Christian Bible to shape their religious experiences, literary voices, and social activism. As Marcia Riggs quotes in Can I Get a Witness, the African American religious experience, especially as it has been actualized by women, combines African sensibilities, New World experiences, Western Christianity, and an activist orientation toward injustice and racial oppression. As a worldview, it encompasses mythic, experiential, doctrinal, ethical, ritual, and social dimensions, and transcends specific organizational or denominational forms. In his book, The Bible and African Americans, Vincent Wimbush states, quote, "In their spirituals and in their sermons and testimonies, African Americans interpreted the Bible in light of their experiences. Faith becomes identification with the heroes and heroines of the Hebrew Bible and with the long-suffering but ultimately victorious Jesus. As the people of God in the Hebrew Bible were once delivered from enslavement, so in the future the Africans sang and shouted would they. As Jesus suffered unjustly but was raised from the dead to new life, so they sang they would be raised from their social death to new life. So went the songs, sermons, and testimonies. The spirituals reflect this process of transforming the book religion of the dominant peoples into the necessarily more complex renderings of perspectives and sentiments of the Africans who were made slaves," end quote. Wimbush says, the spirituals reflect the process of transforming the book religion of Euro-American peoples into the perspectives and sentiments of African American people. However, I think creations like the spirituals are more than just reflections of the process of transforming the Bible. Creations like the spirituals need to be explicitly named the products, the outcomes, the artifacts of that interpretive process. How did African Americans transform what Alan Callahan calls the American talking book, the American poison book, the American good book? The interpretive strategies for this process of transformation and appropriation is something we have to describe. Deriving our accounts from the kind of documentary analysis that notices the similarities and differences in terms of outcomes, genres, media of delivery, inventions, and even inversions. Paying attention to the spirituals is certainly one way to do it. But just as James Weldon Johnson analyzed the spirituals to capture the importance of the Bible in the imaginations of the African American religious folk experience that extends from the period of slavery to the present, I argue the literary works of 19th century African American women writers like Anna Julia Cooper also capture the importance of the Bible in the imaginations of African Americans that blend religious experience with social critique and advocacy. The interpretive products from 19th century African American women's interactions with the Christian Bible and dialogue about the Christian Bible in American society included, but also extended beyond the spirituals, crossing multiple sectors from political to education to healthcare to employment and to even global conversations. I often turn to the works of these women when I need encouragement in the work of interpreting, engaging, and reading the Christian Bible. For some of them, even reading the Bible was an act of defiance and communal actualization. Some read against the prohibitions of literacy for African Americans and women of the day. Others felt a deep calling from God to not only read the Bible, but to proclaim its news and possibilities against the landscape of racism, sexism, and classism. Still other women acquired literacy by reading the Bible, using it as a starting point for finding their literary voice and process, but then moving past the Bible and biblical rhetoric altogether to engage non-biblically focused discourse, such as journalism that is focused on the current events of lynching, poverty, education, healthcare, and access. Here I think of people like Ida B. Wells or Mary Church Terrell. For the last few minutes, I want to do some work of retrieval and documentary analysis, focusing on the agency and interpretive approaches of Anna Julia Cooper, as I said I would do earlier in the paper. Though a complex figure, Cooper's work is an example of the rich heritage of African American women's religiosity and scholarly engagement with the Bible. As such, I think Cooper and others provide a resource for analyzing the current landscape of American social thought imaged in the president's photo op just over a week ago, in which the Bible was wielded. He wielded the Bible as a sign of some perverse form of American nationalism, religiosity, and identity. Such an interpretive perspective, thank you. Such an interpretive perspective is not consonant with the voices of people like Anna Julia Cooper, who carved out their Christian identity and social presence from the margins and underside of America's historic social caste system. I'll show my hand up front. My basic argument is that from the vantage point of African American women's history with the Bible and interpretive approaches, the president's tactical calculation of deploying the image of the Bible as a tool of political propaganda and power appears ridiculously ineffective, because the Bible was not used as a tool to actually speak or say anything. For 19th century African-American women interpreters like Cooper, the significance of the Bible is not found in its image alone or even in the one holding it, but in the voice and platform it gives those stripped of language, agency, story, community, and dignity in a society that claims to know God. The 1993 first volume of Searching the Scriptures, edited by Elizabeth Schultzer Fiorenza, is dedicated to the memory of Dr. Anna Julia Cooper as an African-American foremother of feminist biblical studies. Born into slavery in 1858, Cooper refused to accept that gender and race were barriers to education, training, accomplishment, and global citizenship. She persisted in arguing that caring about the world is most decisive and effectual if we first regard and intentionally attend to those rendered most neglected, exploited, disenfranchised, invisible, and silenced by our Western contrived societies. She received her PhD in history from the Sorbonne in France in 1924 in her 60s, becoming the fourth African-American woman to earn a doctoral degree. But before receiving her PhD, Cooper was already busy thinking, writing, educating, and speaking about the inequities, oppressions, and violence facing those living at the intersections of race, gender, and class. Literary social activists and biblical interpreters like Cooper confronted the 19th century ethos of mainline American society, which mapped notions of inferior, savage, Jezebel, and uncivilized, to name a few, onto the bodies of Africans in America. To confront such racist, sexist, and classist views and pejorative stereotypes, Cooper and others often deployed a politics of respectability that mirrored Western European American conventional values of women's place and work as the values and commitments of African American households and communities. At first glance, it appears many of them ratified conventional patriarchal 19th century women's household roles, such as mother, wife, and homemaker. Yet Cooper and others actually transformed that space as a place where the weight of women's God-given agency, voice, authority, and importance materialized in private and public life. More than simply arriving at plausible interpretations of biblical texts, 19th century African-American women writers and their communities confronted a greater challenge. Facing the challenges of slavery, the Civil War, the brevity of Reconstruction, and the rise of Jim Crow and white supremacy as underwritten by Western biblical interpretive products, African-American women writers and biblical interpreters like Cooper charted their own interpretive pathways and voices through biblical writings like 1 Peter, 1 Timothy, and Romans 13 that were weaponized against them. An 1860 source book called Cotton is King and Pro-Slavery Arguments catalogs common 19th century socio-political arguments in America that championed ideas about the sanctity of slavery, the inferiority of women, and suspicion and concern about foreign newcomers and commerce using biblical text. Yet African-American women interpreters, as exemplified by Cooper, did something else with the Bible. I have two quotations from Cooper's work which demonstrate the conundrum of biblical interpretation in American history and culture, which African-American women biblical scholars in the 19th century wrestled with, and which we continue to wrestle with in this third decade of the 21st century. The clash is, as I stated earlier, between the history of the Bible and biblical interpretive process in Euro-American Christianity and the history of the Bible and biblical interpretive process in African-American women's experience. So I'll read them very quickly for you and give you a couple of comments, and then I'll conclude. As this one states, my own vote, it is true, if I had one, should go to Hoover. As of the two, the man coming nearer to representing the best in American ideals. But speaking personally, the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution are just as precious in my sight as the 18th, and I am unable to warm very enthusiastically with religious fervor for Bible fundamentalists who have nothing to say about lynching Negroes or reducing whole sections of them to a state of peonage worse than slavery. Here are the words of the second quote. I was born in Raleigh, North Carolina. My mother was a slave and the finest woman I have ever known. Though untutored, she could read her Bible and even write a little. It is one of my happiest childhood memories explaining for her, my mother, the subtle differences between Q's and G's or between B's and I's. Presumably my father was her master. If so, I owe him not a soul, and she was always too modest and shamefaced to ever mention him. These two passages from Anna Julia Cooper communicate two contradictory or at the very least, two conflicting perspectives about biblical authority, reading, application, and use in American society. There's a real tension here, and I think it has something to do with how Cooper understands the relationship between the sacred and the secular. Cooper struggles to see the value of assigning biblical interpretation and its products as sacred and truth-telling when it does not make a demand on our daily living among others who are familiar to us as well as unfamiliar. When biblical interpretation does not awaken those reading it to the hardships, violence, pain, inequities around them, which they may even be complicit in, Cooper sees that sort of biblical interpretive process and products as ineffectual. For Cooper's reading, the Bible is sacred and holy because it is utilitarian. For her, biblical reading and its products are sacred when it is not disconnected from everything that is practical, relational, and communal in the here and now. There is no division between the sacred and the secular engagement and use of the Bible for her. The sacredness of the Bible is priceless. The Christian Bible is precisely because it makes a demand on your living. Biblical reading and our interpretive outcomes are precious and sacred because they shape our day-to-day decisions and activities, crafting Christian and interreligious imaginations that make us more human and closer to each other. A major focus of biblical reading and engagement for Cooper is not just change and transformation, but the revolution of communities and society. The sacred drives you, and you don't drive the sacred, according to Cooper. As I stated at the beginning and conclude now, 19th century African-American women's interaction with the Christian Bible and dialogue about the Christian Bible in their 19th century context provides us a dynamic and rich interpretive heritage of approaches and perspectives for dialoguing at the intersections of religiosity, scholarship, history, society, and politics. I also think they provide us new frames for remembering what civil discourse looks like and pathways for courageously using biblical texts, sacred texts of all kinds, to create life-affirming and life-giving spaces for our neighbors and ourselves, rather than wielding it to claim power and foreclose on radical dialogue, interfaith and interreligious conversations, inclusion in society, the church, and the academy. In closing, I leave you with Anna Julia Cooper's words about the purpose of education, and I would say what should be the work of the academy. Hear these words. As interested in the education of a neglected people, and as educators in a circumscribed field of work, we are confronted by a peculiar danger. At the same time, we are buoyed up and helped by a peculiar inspiration and stimulus to devotion. Whether from force of circumstance or from choice and loving consecration, we are ministers and servants of the gospel of intelligence, of moral and material uplift to a people whose need is greater than the average need around us by reason of historic neglect and past and present abuse. End quote. As African-American women biblical scholars and teachers, we are confronted by this peculiar danger and peculiar inspiration. And we write, we research, we translate, we read, we interpret because we hope others in the academy and society and across faith traditions will wake up and realize they too are confronted by this peculiar danger and peculiar inspiration. And we hope they will find the courage to join us by seeing through our eyes and hearing through our ears. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow. Thank you for another insightful and powerful presentation by Dr. Zine and Dr. Smith. It is now time for our monitored Q&A. And as the moderator, I will actually take the first question. So this question is actually for Dr. Zine. Thanks again for your presentation also. You talked about the burden of representation by Muslim women to work against stereotypes and fight against Islamophobia. And what I appreciated the most was the fact that you describe and understand their performativity as small acts of subversion to Islamophobia. I agree that there are different aspects and modalities of agency and resistance, and I appreciated that. I also wanted to ask you, thinking along the lines of like post-colonial theory, right? Would you say that their acts of performativity can also be seen as a form of mockery?
Hey, thank you for that question. Well, I don't know if it is a form of mockery per se. I think that even, there's this notion that has come about, particularly in post 9/11 Islamophobia and discourse and cultural talk, that Mahmoud Mamdani talked about as the good Muslim, bad Muslim paradigm, and how Muslims, out of an abundance of caution of the particular times in which we live and the way that our actions are going to be interpreted within an Islamophobic environment, become very cognizant of performing a particular kind of identity, right? That, and often that is in contrast to the ways that our identities are already constructed through particular discourses that are already there. Right, so this whole sort of post-structuralist idea of how discourse produces particular subjects and how we become interpolated into particular kinds of discourses about us, often then lead to a kind of a counter narrative of, well, we need to show that this is not who we are. There is this sort of internalization of this panoptic gaze, of this panoptic regulation that says that now I have to monitor my behavior and what I do, and I'm very aware now of how others perceive me. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to add to the already negative stereotypes that exist. And so that burden of representation, but also is a kind of a sense of a responsibility that they feel, that we as Muslims need to promote ourselves in a positive way so that we are not reinforcing a stereotype, but that we are not performing to the point where it's something fake, but it is about more of an outward way of showing Islamic values and ethics and norms more positively, so that you will be perceived. Because as minoritized groups, we do not have the luxury to be seen as individuals, right? We don't have that luxury, because whatever one of your co-religionists or someone from the same racial background does reflects on you. There is the collective burden of representation and in our case, of a kind of collective guilt that Muslims must bear for the actions of 9/11, let's say, right? Or if anyone does anything somewhere in the world, you're going to feel it the next day, because you're going to get questions, you're going to get stares, you're going to be called into account. So the performativity is born out of those dynamics.
I guess the reason why I call it a form of mockery is because I guess for me, I can see myself doing that kind of performativity, but like rolling my eyes on the inside. So that's what I meant. But I totally understand what you're saying about it's kind of like you're representing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, you're forced into that role.
That's right.
So thank you so much.
The conditions create that kind of enactment.
Right. I know we have questions. I just have one quick one for Dr. Smith, if that's okay. You spoke about the importance of retrieving and expanding African Americans' legacy, women's legacy of biblical interpretation and approach, right? Is it more than reading and employing and building upon their scholarship and their activism? And how then do we teach that, kind of like in the formal education in the academy and also in the church?
Yeah, I think it is more than just sort of reading. I mean, on some levels, what I'm proposing is a sort of reverse engineering how they get from text to meaning making to voice to what they say. Part of this is to sort of really push against, particularly when you think about womanist voices in the academy, to really push against the ways in which many of us have been formed, really privileging from the perspective that biblical interpretation is at its best when it's doing a sort of historical and even literary work where it's pulling from the heritage, quite frankly, of German biblical criticism, British biblical criticism, American biblical criticism coming out of the 19th century, which is a white male European centering of identity and presence and values of what interpretation is supposed to do. So in some ways, how we have to not only retrieve, we not only read, but we have to reverse engineer. What are the other options for getting the text, reading the text, appropriating the text, and engaging it, not just for intellectual exercises, but also in our living and in sort of working in communities with people. I'll leave it at that.
And then also how to resist scholarship from not looking at it as serious because it's not historical, critical, or literary.
Yeah, I mean, what I find so fascinating about reading these 19th century African-American women is sort of the ways in which they were sort of confronting this on all sides. So on one level, you have the critique coming from outside of African-American communities, particularly, white American communities, but they also are wrestling with the fact that within their own African-American communities, maybe African-American men did not support their public voices and think the only place they should be is in the house. So, I mean, so that's sort of, they really are navigating multiple forms of, I would say, sort of an imposing upon their identities and agencies in a real way that I think is not only courageous, but really can provide us some resources for thinking about how we elevate our own voices and agency and work in the world.
That's right. Thank you. And I found a similarity between Dr. Zine and Dr. Smith, what you just said about these external forces, right? It doesn't necessarily make Muslim and African-American women reactionary, but it kind of compels them, opens up their agency, right? They're compelled to act, to do something because of these outside forces, not necessarily just in reaction, but also just out of their own authentic need and self-preservation. Thank you. I'm actually going to look at the Q&A. I think we have some questions. There's a long one here with several questions for you, Dr. Zine. If you can click the Q&A at the bottom. Do you see it?
Sorry, let me see.
At the bottom of Zoom.
Which one?
It says the one by, I think it's the second one down. Omar Allah.
Okay, yeah, I'm just reading that now.
Okay. If you can just tell us which one you'll address, so because I don't know if our participants can see these questions.
Right. Sorry, I'm just reading it. It's a little small here. So
yeah, they can't see them. So if you can just read
so I'll read them all, and then you can address which one. So
okay, go ahead.
No, if you chose one, go ahead. You can read it.
Oh, do you want me to actually read it? Okay, I was just going to respond. I think the questions, basically, there are a couple of questions, but what is the future of Islamophobia, particularly in the Western world? Is it in retreat or is it raising? What is the solution? I don't know that I have that answer, but, and then there's a question about political Islam or Islamic political movements. I think I'll just answer the latter question because the others are quite big, and I don't have I'm not a prophet, nor do I have a crystal ball as to say where things are going to go, but I would not say that it's getting any better. I think what I've just articulated are the ways in which various kinds of ethno-nationalisms globally are taking up Islamophobia in ways that are promoting genocide, ethnic cleansing, and very extreme forms of, as we see in China, of surveillance and regulation and creating concentration camps and so on. So no, it is not in retreat. The question about political Islam and is that contributing to Islamophobia, I just want to talk about something called the Islamophobia industry, and that's been a project I've been working on here in Canada. There's been work on the Islamophobia industry in the US, but not in Canada. So I've been doing this research, and what it is that we're looking at are the ways that there is a sort of a network of different kinds of actors that contribute to the proliferation of Islamophobia. Some of them are white nationalists, but not all of them. Some of them are religious, right-wing religious groups. Some of them are Muslim dissidents. Some of them are political actors. Some of them are ideologues and so on. But one of the narratives, we've been looking at the discourses of Islamophobia in Canada. There's about 20 of them, but the most predominant ones, not just in Canada, but globally, has to do with this idea of an Islamist boogeyman, this Trojan horse through which Muslims are plotting to take over the world by, being wolves in sheep's clothing, the fifth column, coming in and through stealth promoting Sharia law and sort of creeping Sharia, which will then somehow lead to this Islamist takeover, this sort of demographic threat. This has been very much picked up by white nationalist groups, by political rhetoric of many, in many nations. And it's largely based on a real sort of fallacy that there is some global conspiracy. So I see it more in that way, in the way that that idea of political Islamism as a violent overthrow of democratic states is something that is a threat to Western civilization. That to me is a part of the Islamophobic discourse and myths that's been incredibly powerful in galvanizing the Islamophobia industry around it, but it's patently false. And it gives a false sense that all Islamists are actually, interested in violence, which they're not, or necessarily interested in overthrowing the West. So this is, again, part of a longer history of demonization.
Thank you. Dr. Smith, I see that we have a question, none other than a very great Hebrew Bible scholar, Kimberly Russell. Do you see the question in the Q&A?
I do.
Okay. Would you like to read the question, or?
Sure, I can read it, no worries. So Smith spoke about the various mechanisms 19th century Black women used to share their ideas, such as poetry, published articles, pamphlets, etc. How might modern public-facing scholars make their scholarship broadly accessible in the way pamphlets did for our foremothers? Is there a 21st century mechanism for that? So so this is actually something that one of the reasons why I'm very fascinated by these 19th century African-American women in the ways in which they used that's why I talked about media outputs. They used a variety of media outlets of their time, whatever outlets they could get their hands on, to provide what I would say their voices to the public conversation and discourse. And their voices show up in spiritual autobiographies. They show up in poetry. They show up in short stories. They show up in pamphlets. They show up in public addresses that they're making, and then they go home and revise their addresses to be published in news outlets that are not just national but international in a real way. Like, this was their work. There was a high level of productivity and exposure to their work, which I think is deep. It should be real encouragement for us in terms of part of the heritage. It's not just their interpretive process, but the courage and the audacity and tenaciousness that they demonstrated and in teaching themselves and positioning themselves to use whatever outlets they can. So in this day and age, I actually do think, as public facing, we have to think about what it means to use social media. We have to think about what it means to use the traditional press in print, but also what it means to be on blogs, to be on media online, to think about Instagram, Pinterest. I mean, when do we use images? I use a lot of images, as you can see, for my work. Like that the history of biblical interpretation that they provide us is that engaging the biblical text doesn't foreclose or limit our imaginations, that in fact it should open us up to imagining any number of ways to communicate these voices. I think the issue, particularly for womanist voices in the academy, particularly within theological education and within just the real side and within biblical studies, is that for some, you're balancing your public-facing productivity with the demands of the academic world, such as tenure and review. And a lot of times those discourses and forms of what I would call rhetorical speech or rhetorical acts or actions are actually different. and so sometimes you'll have public-facing scholars or those who are potentially that, who are also navigating other avenues, other systems in the process that don't value that work as much.
You said exactly what I was going to say in response, because I do believe that we are still creating all of those things like pamphlets and using social media and things that our foremothers used. But like you said, we run up against these confines and rules and regulations of the academy, what does and doesn't count for tenure, and then how do you use that time, because the clock is ticking, right? So then you're struggling to split your time between, writing for news outlets or social media, being a public figure, and then also writing peer review articles and all of this and whatnot for the Academy.
Yeah, yeah.
Speaking of the ticking clock, Dr. Smith, why don't we take one more question?
Okay.
Let's see. Did you all see anything? Let's see. I'm getting, okay, there it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, there's a lot of comments, not necessarily questions. One says, in our culture area, the religious life is liquid and peacefully based on the web and spirit and ethos of kinship web.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that pertains to what you were talking about, Dr. Smith, in terms of the different ways, the connection that Anna Kubo were looking at in terms of the Bible.
Yeah, yeah.
See, there's a question to Dr. Smith from Flavius. He says, is the voice of Afro-American women academically is a way to show African-American women's identity in relation to the past American social, religious, and political context, which is also colored by racism?
Yeah, so I think when you talk about African-American women academic voices, one of the tasks, as I said, I think is retrieving those histories and recovering those, and part of that has to do with the fact of it being invisible and not valued for such a long time, that you do have that some of that work is retrieving it because it wasn't there. As if it's not present in the academic discourse as strongly, as if to say it wasn't there. and in fact it was. So that's why I said we're not necessarily inventing something new. We're retrieving it, expanding it, and extending it. I also want to say that I don't think it's just the work of recovering from the past. There is a major part of that in which there are real opportunities and the need for defining what that means and what that looks like now. So one of the things, if you heard me, and I'll leave it at that, if you heard me, I kind of kept pushing and wanting to extend to think about global conversations, interreligious conversations, multicultural conversations, which they had some sense of, but not as strongly, whereas now I'm very clear that a forum like this demonstrates the power of building these sort of cross-cultural, cross-linguistic, cross-religious conversations, and thinking about your identity in relationship with, partnership with, allyship with others.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Graffin, I don't know if we have just one more minute. I have one more question for Dr. Zine, or is time up?
Time's up.
Well, I'll text you.
I do want to give Tina a few minutes. So thank you both so much. Dr. Shaner said something last night that really struck me. She said, having a history imputes agency. And I think Dr. Smith tonight talking about retrieving those histories, those voices, so important. And then Dr. Zine, you asked the question in the current COVID crisis, women's veils and niqabs and a mask. You asked the very haunting question that we need to keep in front of us. You know, what is performing good citizenship? That depending on who you are, that's a question that needs to be raised publicly, right? So thank you for that. That's fantastic. I'd like to introduce now Tina Demo, who is the Director of Admissions at Hartford Seminary. She's going to do an infomercial for us.
Good evening, everyone. This will be very brief. I would love to just say that it was a wonderful evening, and I thank all our panelists and our moderators. This is a tough act to follow, this conference. I just want to take a moment and thank you all for joining us and for participating in what has become a wonderful conference that we've had over the past 4 years on different topics. For those of you who are new to Hartford Seminary, these are precisely the kinds of programs we love offering and do offer. So I hope you will stay tuned, check in our website, our Facebook page about the different types of programs that we offer throughout the year. Dr. Grafton mentioned that there are many firsts to Hartford Seminary, and I'm just going to take a moment to say that you are welcome to join us not only for these programs, but for courses that we have to offer. You may take them for graduate credit, you may audit them for personal enrichment. I am one of the contacts who would work with you as you explore the courses that we offer. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have via email or Zoom. And so I hope you will stay in touch with us. As you probably know, Hartford Seminary offers a variety of programs: a Master of Arts in Religious Studies, a Cooperative Master of Divinity, an Islamic chaplaincy program. And so we are quite varied in what we offer, and there's a little something for everyone. So I hope that you will continue to join us. I feel like we've made so many new friends this evening. I also want to say thank you to all of our alums and students who participated tonight, and we hope to see you again through the admissions office. Good evening.
Thank you, Tina. Before everybody leaves, there's a little poll. You have some activities. So Susan, could you release that poll and let them know what this is? We have a little poll about how you heard about the conference. If you could take a minute to click into that. We want to see where everybody's coming from. And it's great to see so many people from around the world. People who've gotten up very early or who didn't go to bed. I don't know. I'm not here to determine that, but thank you so much for participating. So how did you hear about the conference? Polls coming in fast and furious. Looks like the majority through the Hartford Seminary e-newsletter, some through Facebook, and some through a friend or a colleague. So that's great. We're connected. And someone even said I was invited by Tina Demo. Good job, Tina. Well, thanks everyone for joining us this evening. We invite you back tomorrow, same time, same channel, for our last evening. Tomorrow night, we'll have a panel of 4 individuals who will speak and share in their own work, both professional and academic. And we will also hear from a short book talk on the history of Islam and 21 women by a colleague of ours who published the book recently. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Welcome back.